Hello, and welcome to ATARC's webinar series. Today, we have two topic experts that will share how legislation has pushed their agency to modernize and any hurdles that they've had to face, in addition to discussing the roles of zero trust and identity practices. My name's Kirsten Patton. I'm with Dale Carnegie Tampa Bay, and I will be moderating today's panel discussion. ATARC stands for the Advanced Technology Academic Research Center, and ATARC is a nonprofit organization that facilitates collaboration between government, industry, and academia in order to accelerate technology modernization initiatives. ATARC provides ongoing opportunities for cross-agency collaboration through on-site interaction, learning, and market research. I want to welcome all of our attendees here today, and a special thanks to Simone Woodward and the entire Ping Identity team for helping us put this on. Before we begin, I want to encourage you to please submit questions of your own down below in the Q&A section of this platform, and don't forget to answer any of the poll questions as they come up throughout today's discussion in order to ensure that you receive your CPE credits. With that being said, I would now like to welcome our two panelists. Can you please come on camera, and you can go ahead and unmute yourself because we're just going to begin with a round of introductions. So starting with Frank, please share with us who you are, what agency you're with, what your role is there, and anything else that you'd like our audience to know about you.
Sure. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Frank Indiviglio. I'm the CTO at NOAA. And I'm also the acting deputy director for high performance computing. So the agency, aside from weather prediction, has a big surface area in terms of mission area from the edge of the sun to the bottom of the ocean. So there's a lot of environmental modeling, computation modeling, and field work that goes on in support of that. And identity management is a big part and a growing part of our technology services that we need to secure and support.
Yeah, and hey everyone. So my name is Brian Rosensteel. I'm the U.S. Federal CTO for Ping Identity. I've actually spent the majority of my career in and around public sector. So I think last time I counted it all up, just shy of 20 years, and more than a dozen of that specifically within FICAM. So yeah, I've kind of spent a good bit of time, whether it be with the National Cancer Institute and NIH, where I started, or some of the kind of on-site engineering work I did kind of throughout the federal government, really around implementing different types of multi-factor authentication, and really looking at what we need to do from a centralization of authentication and authorization standpoint. So excited to be here. Excited to kind of talk about where we're at, and learn as much from you guys as hopefully you learn from me.
Thank you both so much. And since we've got two of you here, we can just ping pong back and forth with the questions. So starting with Frank first, then, for the question number one that I really want to dive into, what are some key tools that your organization utilized in order to meet specific criteria for the zero trust architecture? Could you talk to me about what that journey at NOAA looked like for you?
Mm-hmm. So there's a lot of them. I don't know if key is a good word, because there's a lot of tools that we need to work with, and different parts of the organization to kind of get started on this journey and continue on this journey. And a lot of the work, moving towards zero trust has been being done in NOAA before, was being done in NOAA before, the executive order and kind of it being a thing. And because of the diversity of the components that we have across the agency, right? A lot of that work was consolidating that user identity, right? It's a process that's ongoing. So we've consolidated into, we've traditionally consolidated into systems, right? Where we consolidate AD or ICAM, and now we're consolidating that into ICAMs. So a lot of that consolidation work has been a kind of a key role, making sure that we're providing secure access points for larger resources. So if you look at things like high performance computing within NOAA, right, giving people a single pane, I guess, for lack of a better term, of access. So we're not relying on workstations, right? We're giving them an environment where we can We can trust that user as they come in and know who they are. And now we provide them an environment to work in without having to worry about other IT devices in the middle of that communication chain. And we're looking to extend that model out to even general support, so desktops, laptops, right? And it's more of a push towards being remote, working from anywhere, being able to get your job and the mission done for wherever you need to be with whatever equipment that you have. So again, I think consolidating those identity points and access points has been really important there. And I think there's a lot of supporting tools that are also as important, right? So things like machine learning allows our security folks to improve identification and response, and it frees them up to be a more impactful tool for the rest of the organization, right? They can do, they have a better view of the organization, and they can use the combination of these tools, again, to provide that architecture, support of that architecture, and a better response overall.
Thank you, Frank. Brian, over to you next.
Yeah, so I'm not really an organization, so I can't say what tools have we implemented. What I can say is, because we've worked very closely with kind of a couple different departments across the federal government. We've worked, I kind of talked to specifically, and not naming them, but work we've done from, major Department of Defense initiative, and then also what we're doing in the civilian. And it echoes a lot of exactly what Frank talked about. It's, really starting with getting a handle on the identities that are coming into the environment. And when I talk about getting a handle on the identities coming into an environment, really what we're referring to there is understanding more than just the person behind the keyboard. And sometimes it's not even a person, right? Machine or application. And understanding, vetting that went into it, entitlements for those individuals and entities, and really getting kind of this catalog of data that we can build off of. So we kind of see that first. Usually it's some type of IGA tool that we see kind of implemented. And we also see the aggregation of this data into a directory structure, right? So, usually work with organizations to understand, hey, how do we maybe not fully collapse, but centralize as much as possible data. And Frank, it sounds like that's exactly kind of where you guys had started. And so then at that point, when we see the logical jump in point is, okay, now I've got a collection of data and attributes that I can pull from in logical places. And so now I'm going to take and start abstracting authentication away from the endpoint applications. And what I mean by that is really centralization, right? Some type of SSO platform to be able to do so, that now I've got this good data that's in the IGA, that's in a master user record from a directory structure. Now I can actually have really meaningful policies that I can orchestrate to enforce that during that authentication. What we haven't seen yet, but where the conversations are and what I'm expecting, and Frank, I'm curious your thoughts on this too, but really within 2023 is taking that next step, right? So tying it back to OMB 22-09, most people already have a handle on multi-factor authentication at some point, right? Because PIVs and CACs have been prevalent for 2 decades. There's usually some use cases where they're trying to shore that up, or maybe they need to migrate off of less phishing resistant authenticators, but there's a clear pathway for doing it. The centralization is what we've been talking about. But the last piece of really shifting over to attribute-based access control or rule-based or policy-based access control is what I think I see people gearing up towards, and the push that I'm expecting this year of getting more dynamic authorizations in place. All right, I've got these entitlements and attributes, and I've got a single sign-on engine that's picking these up and passing them along. Now, how do I centralize my authorization, and how do I build in dynamic policies to enforce it so that it's very scalable across my organization? I think the other area too, so obviously that's from an individual tool set and what I'm seeing, and really that's kind of what I talk about, the walk, crawl, run cycle of implementing zero trust. What we're also seeing a lot is, how do we get these tool sets to work in complex environments? And so it's not just something where I can just go out and use a cloud service or a FedRAMP offering or an IL offering if I'm in the DoD, and get that to work with everything, because I might have DDoS environments, or I might have air-gapped environments, I might have things that are mission critical that I need to make sure I still have the strong enforcement of identity, really. And I can't always rely upon that external connectivity. So I think that has been a lot of the effort that we've seen over the past year as well, of I need to centralize as much as possible, but I also need to centralize and work in these decentralized, complex environments. How do I do that? So yeah, I think that's where the efforts have been, at least so far.
Mhm. And just if I could for a second, I agree with you, and I think that's going to be the right, because we, even within the single agency that I'm going to talk about, right, or that I'm talking about, having that complexity, it is a big part of the way we operate, right? I mean, HPC is its own complexity, field operations are their own, right? Every line office has their own complexity, and they have their own kind of interpretation of their digital world, right? And how do you make that come together? So the centralization of identity is a little easy, but getting that kind of role-based consolidation is much harder. So you almost have to follow a similar path, right? Consolidate where you can, build frameworks where they have the flexibility to meet everyone's needs, and then kind of grow into a more consolidated environment over time. But I agree with you that that's going to take a lot of the work and going into the future.
Any other comments there before we move on to our next question?
No, I think it's a good level set.
Okay.
I'd be curious too. I would encourage audience participation always.
Yeah.
If there's an area that we miss, feel free to throw it in as a question. I think we just have Q&A or is chat open for everyone too?
Absolutely. Yes, please send in your questions, send in your comments. So, Frank, how has your organization reduced the burden on agency staff to manage individual accounts and credentials?
That's a good question. So a lot of it has been through the consolidation we're talking about, right? So that planning process and that kind of open discussion is kind of an eye-opening discovery process for the staff and for their customers, right? And it's opened up a lot of or enhanced, I would say, the communication between those organizations, right? So in that planning, I think a lot of the the viewpoints of various components of the agency have been kind of shed to light and better understood, and that has actually reduced the burden. There's lots of technical tools that reduce burden, right? Implementation of ICAM solutions obviously do that. The access points that we talked about before, those kind of connections reduce that technical burden and allow a lot of that staff to kind of become more customer facing from their day-to-day admin jobs and kind of become mission enablers rather than administrators, right? So that kind of planning and that discussion has really relieved, I think, a lot of the burden. They're technical challenges, right? And we all have to work through them. But I think the organizational pathways that it creates are the things that actually reduce the burden, right? Instead of everyone gets a better understanding, there's less interpretation, right? You get this communication connection points open, and that really reduces, I think, a lot of the overhead that we see in these kinds of migrations.
Frank, Brian?
Yeah, and I agree. And Frank, your story kind of echoes across of what I've seen in other areas. It's interesting. I mean, talking specifically about the credential piece, and that has been an area that is very complex. And so, I know two different kind of stories. Is I was talking with U.S. Department on the civilian side earlier in the year, and they brought in 100 different over 100 individuals on the same Zoom, and we did everything that we could to break it, but it worked. And it was all about getting everyone to come in to understand, hey, look, this is what we're doing. This is the pathway for centralization. Here's what we want to do from SSO standpoint. Here's what we're going to do for credential standpoint. Here's what we're going to do from a directory standpoint. And, getting that communication out, while at the same time asking everyone, hey, let us know what you're using. And the other example I'll give of that is another department I know in a single office. They manage, I want to say, 4 different credentials right now, and they're thinking of opening up a fifth, right? And this is one office, right? So they have the PIV. So obviously this is an ICAM office. So they have the PIV card. They have smart cards for non-PIV eligible employees. And then, so there's two, and that's just physical smart cards. Then they have the Derive PIV, which is an X509 variant, right? So there's our third. And then they're also using push authenticators on a mobile device. And now they're looking at, well, we're going to need to deprecate that because, it's not phishing resistant. So they're looking at bringing in a fifth of, a FIDO authenticator, all out of the exact same office. And there are other offices in that department that have also deployed similar types of, hey, we can use the PIV, but we have these use cases where it doesn't work. And so understanding across the organization that there's these kind of like individual point solutions for credentials that are out there. How do I do that in a way that doesn't introduce a ton of friction into users being like, yep, you no longer can use that authenticator. Now you get to enroll in this new thing. That may not work. One, users are going to not be happy about having to enroll for yet another authenticator. And then they're going to get confused. Which one am I using for this application? Which has been a huge struggle. We're even on the exact same device, right? Because now we're seeing certain types of security tokens or security keys that are out there that can actually handle X509 and FIDO and OTP all together. Well, now you have to remember which one am I using for which application for which particular role that I'm supporting. All of that has been very challenging. And I've seen some where it hasn't gone as well, but where it's gone better is when they've brought those stakeholders in, the example of that bringing in 100 different individuals and saying, what are your use cases? Why are you using this? And then being able to say, okay, we're going to take and, allow you to bring your own authenticator, BYOA, and bring that into our centralization story with an expectation that over time, we're going to transition you off. But it's not a direct cut, rip and replace. Instead, it's just initial enhance and extend, and then figure out where we've got overlap and how we can, as painlessly as possible, standardize. But yeah, that's a real challenge, and that comes from, 2 decades of, trial and error around credentials. And especially when we look at the past, 5, maybe 8 years of mobile adoption in the federal government and the challenges that has presented against something like a physical PIV card. And then, the different strategies and solutions that have gone out there, really usually it's on a case-by-case basis or application-by-application basis to implement solutions to get it to work.
Mm-hmm. That's a good point, that the application or device to device, right? I mean, the workflows vary, and when you are using different devices, today I'm using a Chromebook, or tomorrow I'm using a Windows bot, whatever they may be, or phone, right? The parts and pieces may not all fit together in that workflow for whatever device you're talking about. So you have to really have that discussion to kind of get into those details to figure out, all right, here's what won't work, what are alternatives, right? And how do we combine those alternatives to make something workable? But I completely agree. Those are really good points.
Yeah, that's one of the things I'm actually excited about. When I think back to when I was engineering on site, we'd have a checklist, right? And I was in the PKI office because that's my general background. And we'd have a checklist. Does your application support PKI? If it doesn't, it needs to. And what gets me excited about what we're seeing pushed down around the centralization about utilizing things like SSO is that checklist should go away or be modified to where, do you support these common federation protocols like a SAML, like an OIDC? If it does not, why doesn't it? What's the challenge? And then, if we can't get a federation language on it, certain legacy applications, what can we get to it? And that, I think, is going to allow that better consolidation. Because like you were saying, Frank, is well, if the application doesn't support my primary authenticator, then, and I need to have strong authentication in it, or multi-factor authentication, what does it support? And that goes away to then, I'm going to standardize around these languages, and it's going to allow me to be so much more scalable. When we think about events that have occurred, well, it's tangential to identity, but when we think about when Log4j came out and basically the entire internet needed to be patched, you can think about that where all of a sudden I need to dynamically change what I'm doing from an identity authenticator standpoint. If I've got that centralized, it's really easy to do it. If I have to go application by application, which is how I used to, or I've traditionally been doing it, then that's the challenge. And that's, of course, the exact reason why they put that, right? Why OMB wrote that into, what is that, Section A. So, yeah.
And it's a good place, that kind of discussion is a good place for modernization, right? I mean, why are you supporting this legacy application, or why are you supporting it this way, right? It's a good, I mean, even, from my HPC hat, not my CTO hat, right? That has been a big push for us to modernize things, like how we do data transfers or authenticated data transfers or logins. Okay, well, we've done it this way for a long time, but maybe we need to rethink it because it doesn't do, it may not fit this pattern, and it's actually made a better service at the end, right? So those are kinds of things I think are helpful too, and they do relieve burden in the long run, right? If we're all moving in the same direction.
Great. We are going to call for our first poll question. If we could get that up on the screen. Which phishing resistant MFA does your organization intend to leverage? For our audience, please go ahead and respond to that. And Frank and Brian, any other comments on this topic before we move on to my next question? I want to make sure you guys had an adequate chance to say everything you wanted to share. All right. Moving on then to our next question. Brian, I'll have you start this time. What components of Zero Trust have you seen allow for a defensible architecture in a new environment?
Yeah, so seeing the poll questions coming in, that's what I expected is and I think we have to have flexibility. And I think that ties very well into what you just asked. So that agility is 100% a requirement when you want to have defensibility. If you are single threaded or you're static in what you're leveraging, even for something as strong as the PIV. And again, I had a PKA background. I mean, I love the technology behind the physical smart cards. There's more than 7 different layers of physical protection on those cards, right? I mean, they're incredible enterprise grade authenticators. And yet getting one to work on something like a mobile device is really challenging to get that card to actually insert, which is why now we're seeing kind of 2 different variants of trying to have strong phishing resistant authenticators on a mobile device. Having that where you can very dynamically switch during an authentication, I think is going to be key. And so, and then invoking different mechanisms during it. So what do I mean by all that? Well, if a user comes in and they authenticate with a physical PIV, we've got really strong identity binding that's going into it. Therefore, I might be able to get away with, okay, well, this is enough. And now I'm going to allow them to have these types of accesses versus, hey, they came in on a mobile device with a maybe a FIDO credential or an X509 variant. And I know that's a derived credential. So maybe because I know it's also coming in from a mobile device, because it's the only place where that X509 derived credential exists in my organization. Now I need to orchestrate in my MDM and have my MDM play into my authentication to make sure that the device profile is fitting, right? So same authentication, 2 different policy orchestrations that are resulting based upon the authenticator being presented, and then I feed that information over to my authorization engine. So you see very quickly how we have different profiles, different digital identities that are being asserted in order to make those continuous decisions, because really, and I've stolen this quote and I love this quote, authentication is merely the enabler of authorization. And so that's kind of the idea here, is that we get these attributes based upon how the user's coming in, the contextual base, with our static attributes that we have in directories and things like that, and then we make those decisions off of it. So from an identity aspect, the identity pillar of Zero Trust, I think that's where we're going to get the most kind of defensibility, because we're able to have something that is dynamically changing based upon how the user is operating. And again, that user doesn't just have to be a person behind the keyboard, but it can be another application doing an API request against a data set or something like that.
Thank you, Brian. Frank, what are your thoughts or experiences with that?
So I don't think they're very different from what Brian was talking about. I think the the combining the different identity management or, MFA technology that we're talking about has been, has helped us kind of build a user environment that's extensible past, what their application was before, right? So again, I'll fall back to my HPC side, but so right now, you log in once, you have a single sign-on, that certificate that's on that PIV card gets, propagated out to your work, so that we know that, that user is using that work, that user is instigating that workflow, and it's attached to that identity. The data transfers that follow are attached to identity, and it's all kind of, you can then automate off of the identity management that you have, right? And that's allowed for us to not only track, how things are used and who's using what, but it also provides an extra layer of security throughout the workflow of the work that's going on. So we want to make, that coupled with smoothing out kind of the user environment, right? We're widening the identity management across multiple systems or silos, applications, however you want to put it, allows us to kind of have an integrated environment from the user perspective. So they can sign on once, they can do their kind of day-to-day job, they can do HPC work, they can do whatever they need to. So allowing that kind of not only the consolidation, but the extensibility of the tools that we have available allows us to integrate it further into our workloads and workflows, and it allows us to, provide an architecture that's extensible for a number of different kind of scientific missions.
Frank, I just want to make sure that we covered this for Paula wrote in. What type of identity product set are you using for the consolidation?
So we focus on an ICAM solution, and if we want to get more specific, I can get back to you. But it is a consolidation of things like Active Directory into ICAMs, and then we use PIV cards for most of our identification management, and then like Brian said, we have PIVs, we have access cards for folks that don't qualify for PIVs, and then all the way down to X509 certificates for the scientific workloads, and we're moving to things like hardware keys to make the workforce more mobile and usable across all the platforms they have to access throughout their day. Hopefully that answers that question.
Yeah, and Richard wrote in with a similar question too, but Richard said, given that divisions in large organizations might rely on different solutions, he has experienced that one has to establish multiple authentication workflows and specifications, such as requesting headers. Is there anything else that you want to add around how you tackle this challenge and reach that consolidation goal?
So let me make sure. I'm going to read the question. So for us, I think it's in that consolidation discussion, right? So Brian and I both talked about this before. We consolidate where we can, right? We make sure we understand where we can't, and then work towards building a framework where we can in the future, right? So a lot of these, a lot of the things that we have to support are maybe very different. They may be very remote. I mean, there are scientists, at the polls using cloud services to do data analysis right from a remote location. So we have to be we have to have flexibility, but we also have to approach that consolidation goal. So it is a lot of, a lot of kind of discussion between those groups and working towards that enterprise solution, but having an eye towards the flexible framework that allows for remote access, whatever that may be. So it's a give and take in terms of flexibility and enforcing what we need to enforce. But again, it's a back and forth between authentication methods and things that we have available.
Yeah, I think the only thing, and I agree with everything you said, Frank. I think the only other thing that I might add to that is, and this is an area where we haven't seen it identified as much in various policy and guidance, is that, a lot of times we focus on the SSO piece, right? I'm gonna have single sign-on, I'm gonna standardize over federation languages. But as and I apologize, was it, as Richard absolutely correctly identified, there's some applications that use header-based authentication, and again, they just can't really be sent a SAML or an OIDC token, and so that's where it is really important to make sure that your strategy also includes things that are going to handle those types of applications. And that's why kind of before I was talking about, and speaking at a high level, right? Because I'm not trying to say, oh, go and use this product, that product, that product. But that's why I talked about making sure that you have centralization for authorization, centralization for authentication. Authentication, really, that's single sign-on. And then, as long as you have incorporated into kind of your plan, like a web access management solution, whether it be like a web access gateway, whether it be traditional agent-based, a lot of times those types of solutions have that flexibility of being able to pass along the different federation languages, SAML, OIDC, or header-based authentication, or there's one or two other things that we haven't mentioned, where you can also pass along different types of things so that the application ultimately gets the information it needs to allow that user to be authenticated and allow that user or entity to gain access to the information it needs. So we typically see that additional component into the architecture, right? So Frank, you identified, right, have a good directory. We talked about the importance of a really strong, focused identity governance solution for the entitlements management. That becomes really important when we start talking about like just-in-time provisioning, where I'm not necessarily going to store that user entity in the directory, but I still need to make sure that user gets or entity gets entitled. This is for like external federation use cases, partners, other agencies, organizations that need to collaborate in. And then you have your SSO federation engine that's going to be really managing those sessions and has your flexible authentication policies. And then you'll have that authorization engine, and that's usually some type of web access management that can really help translate further to the different protocols that are going to be needed for those applications. And that's been kind of the reference architecture that I've seen across. Obviously there are other things that can get included in there, PAM and others that we haven't talked about, but usually that's the core that I've seen, and that seems to be working really well to hit most use cases. I never speak in absolutes, and I'm never going to say that'll solve everything, because that's the point of that discovery process of knowing what's out there, because there are absolutely, case in point, right? Voyager 1 and 2, we can still talk to them. They the code for that, the application for that, right? That was written in the 70s, and you can't modernize that, right? I suddenly can't, be authenticating to Voyager with a PIV. So, it's an extreme example, but there are these use cases out there that, is important to know, that does exist, to make sure that you can accommodate it as best as you can, or no, I can't accommodate it, therefore I cannot sunset this particular solution until that mission has been fulfilled.
Thank you. And Carl Bremer writes in wanting to know a little bit more about identity management for the public to access government systems. Any thoughts around that?
So I can jump in on that. So there are a number of ways we can do that, right? So GSA has a service called login.gov. So let me start off with, I think this is a growing question, right? From the scientific aspect within my agency, right? We collaborate with the public, not just through the forecast, but through research, other information about the environment, and I think this is going to will continue to be something that we discuss in the near future and probably a little longer term, although I'd rather it get solved in the near term. So we can't. There are really good examples out there like login.gov, right? So GSA, if you use USA Jobs or any of the GSA websites that require a login, right? Login.gov is a good access method for that, and we work with GSA to employ that at our security perimeter for places that we interact with the public. So we have programs like the Earth Prediction Innovation Center, which its mission is to talk to its collaborators and the academic community to improve weather modeling. And so these are the kind of services and problems that we have to tackle to get that communication going. So there are ways to do it. I think it's on all of the agencies, not just mine, to kind of integrate those into our authentication methods, identity management methods, to make sure that we have that link to the public, and so that we can have be a good have a good relationship between the public and government, and provide the information that we need to the public.
Yeah, and that's definitely, I mean, that's a challenge. And it's not just a technical challenge, right? It's a political challenge too. The persistent storage of public user data is just it's a minefield, right? There's no way to dance around it. And we've seen that, especially in the past year. And we know that Congress has gotten involved in a couple different specific use cases. We know that NIST Special Publication 863 Draft 4 is also trying to tackle this, and it's one of the reasons why it's not out yet, right? And understanding, making sure that we have equitable services that are as bias free as possible, but also then that we account for that persistent storage of data. And that's something that I think anytime I'm talking about public to G2C, right, government to citizen, public to access those government systems, I'm always like, okay, what data do you need to collect? Where are you storing that data? Does that really need to be in a third-party application? And then also making sure that data is also properly separated, right? So I don't necessarily want citizen data sitting right alongside in the same directory as my internal user data for a multitude of reasons, right? Centralization is great, but we need to do it within a way that makes sense. There's common sense behind it. And the best practices does dictate some type of separation for certain types of classes of data. And so that's something that everyone's talking about, but very tentatively. And I'll say I haven't seen a solution yet that I think has addressed that directly. And I think we are waiting collectively on what NIST comes out in their next set of guidance through 863. Before we see a lot of that. So again, I think that's, Carl, I think it's great that you brought that up. I think we're going to see a lot more focus on that really next year, once that draft comes out and feedback goes in. The interesting thing about it, though, that we do know is that more and more, again, phishing resistant authenticators, they're not going away. We know that that's now a hard requirement for an organization to offer, not necessarily restrict, but allowing it to be used, right? So we do see that permeating. I know as an example, when I log in to the VA to look up my Navy benefits, I know that, I have that option of using a strong security key to go into it. And it is nice to start seeing that. I'd love to see more public awareness of why it's important to not use things like SMS, text messaging, and to use these stronger authenticators. But I think that'll come in time as well.
Thank you both. We're going to pause real quick and pop up our second poll question. Where does your organization intend to manage their ICAM solution? Please take a moment to respond. And thank you everybody at home for sending in the questions and the comments. It's been really great discussion so far. And we have another question from Shane Black. So we'll go ahead and respond to this one. With USPTO recently acquiring a SASE solution, do you envision NOAA going down the same path to assist with the zero trust journey?
That's a good question. I think that all of we're PTO and NOAA, right? We're all in the Department of Commerce family, right? So we want to make sure that we go down similar paths. I think we need to we need to learn from each other too, right? So I think it's crucial that we do. So those kinds of discussions I think are ongoing and need to continue and probably grow. So in the short, yes, and if not, we'll certainly learn from it, right? So and the department will help set that tone. So
thanks, Frank. Brian, did you get a chance to see the poll results? Any comments on that?
I did. It's not surprising, and it's an area where I think I'm not gonna say that OMB 22-09 didn't address this. They did, especially the draft. I think it was more clear, in my opinion, in the draft than the final version that we got around centralization and how that's handled with multiple environments. But I'm not surprised to see that. But I will say from criticism, I think it's not something that has been communicated as well, right? So we look at Section A, we look at Action Item 1, the centralization of identity management systems. There's no way that I can centralize all of my identity for an organization, right? Maybe I can get away with it within some, but there are specific environments. Well, Frank, I mean, NOAA's got floating data centers, right? I can't centralize everything to just the home office. It will not meet mission needs. I must have a decentralized, if you will, infrastructure for that. But I need to make sure that I can centralize the policy management of that as much as possible where it makes sense. And there are very specific ways to go about doing that. The issue is that I think some organizations, not all, have kind of looked at this as I need a checkbox. Therefore, I need to go out, I'm going to get a FedRAMP service, and that'll solve my need. And they're not doing that thinking of, well, how in the world can because I've got maybe my emails on premise, or I've got mission critical application on premise. Not saying like the internet goes down, just the connectivity to the internet goes down. What does that mean for those mission critical applications that simply can't fail open, can't fail close, they just can't fail? How do I make that work? Well, if you're not careful and you don't think about those multiple environments, we're going to be right back to where we are right now, where I've got piecemeal ICAM solutions that have been stood up for individual application use cases, instead of still doing centralization where it makes sense, but making sure that I have resiliency across it to where, most everything is run out in a FedRAMP environment. But these special mission critical applications are done from an on-prem environment, but I built in communication between the two to still make my user think that they're getting the single sign-on experience across. I think that's the balance that we need to do. And I'll be honest, I think that's one of the areas where, the executive order and others have kind of fallen short to address that complexity that's inherent in these systems.
Thank you, Brian. Frank, any comments from you?
No, I completely agree with Brian saying. I especially in the complexity, right? I mean, we're an agency that utilizes satellites, right? Those are things that they operate differently than a normal IT system. But even in the world of IoT, right now we have a lot of uncrewed vehicles in the ocean, in other places, and the policy definition that Brian was talking about becomes really, really important, right? Because now you have your perimeter, for lack of a better term, has gotten all the way out on the edge here, and that's a risk, right? So we want to make sure that those policies have to be kind of defined in a pretty well thought out way before deployment, so that if something happens, when you lose contact or something, you still get the performance that you need or the data that you need, and again provide the users with the services that they need to get their jobs done, but without having that security barrier or lack of communication, whatever it may be, right?
Thank you both. Frank, next question. I'm going to start with you this time. Since the recent pandemic, how has your organization shifted in regards to enhancing and extending security protocol?
That's a good question. So it's unfortunate that we had to learn under the terms that we did, but I think and not just I think across organizations, whether they're public or private, collectively we've done a really good job of kind of proving that we can work in a remote environment and get our mission and jobs done, even if we are unable to see each other face to face in any short amount of time. But specifically for us, right, we've thought about how we do things, right? From our HPC perspective, right, that's a remote program, and it's been a remote program for a very long time. So because we have our users spread out across the country and sometimes the world, and data centers spread across the country, which includes cloud and other things, right? That program was positioned remote access only for a long time. But even with the pandemic, we were able to enhance that, right? We're, again, going back to what I was talking about before, where we're moving towards taking the IT burden away from the user and placing it closer to the resources that they need. So in a previous world, right, everyone was kind of relying on their workstation, like my laptop here that I'm talking to you over. So if you wanted to do remote connections, right, you needed that laptop, you needed that piece of IT, and you still kind of do, right? You need something. But a lot of the functions that they would normally do on their laptop now comes through a web browser, right? The desktop is now pushed to that web browser. So that allows us to not only reduce the burden in terms of security or identity management, right? You single sign on, you have all your tools. You can move between the systems that you need to from a centralized access point. But it also reduces the burden on overall IT costs, right? You can reduce admin costs, you can reduce licenses, all kinds of benefits that have happened from there. But again, it allows us to kind of seal that environment so that you can do your job in that environment. You really don't need to rely on outside IT other than the web browser to get there. And you can see that extending out to now desktops, right? We're talking about moving a lot of kind of our general purpose desktop functions to, a mix of web, browsers as desktop or SaaS-based tools where, it doesn't matter where you are, you can be productive. So whether you're at home or you're in the office or wherever you may be on travel, whatever that may be, your environment doesn't change. Your ability to do your job doesn't change, and then you can access all the data that you need to, right? So one of the things that we kind of saw when we first were sent to remote status from the pandemic was, well, all the things on the network shares in the office were hard to get to now, right? You had to go through a couple different hoops to get to them, and those are the kind of lessons that we've learned. We consolidate these things. We can look at ways to make them accessible from no matter where you're operating from. So those are the kinds of ways I think that the experience is reshaping the organization.
Brian?
Yeah, I was gonna say I don't have a lot to contribute to that. I think Frank kind of nailed it. I pretty much agree with everything that he said. I think it really, in the beginning, it really highlighted all the inherent trust. So I don't really like the term zero trust. I prefer zero inherent trust because the point is, how do you have zero trust but still trust but verify? It's contradicting. But we had a lot of inherent trust in systems. Things like, I'm going to assume that a user is always come in from a workstation that's on a physical drop in a physical building. And I'll have some use cases with remote users coming in over VPN, but those will be very isolated. To the exact opposite, almost everyone's coming in remotely. Very few people are in that building on that drop, and so it highlighted a lot of those things we took for granted. But I mean, I agree with kind of what Frank said and how it's gone about. It's been a interesting transition, is the way I'll phrase it, over 2 years. I think one of the things I'm very hopeful about with it is that, as where the pandemic is shifting to, whatever classification we want to call it now, people are coming back to work, is that we're still seeing a lot of remote working and teleworking taking place, which I think is great. And I think it is, fundamentally altered the way that we're going to be able to go about fulfilling missions. And in many ways, I think it allows for an enhancement. So when we start thinking about issues that we've had about attracting talent into the government space, one of the biggest problems has always been, well, I don't want to go into that office building every single day, right? As someone who used to live in DC, trust me, commuting onto an office location is a pain. But being able to do that enablement to allow people to work more from offices kind of all over across the country or even across the world, I think that allows us to get more competitive again about attracting that talent back in. So I'm actually, there's heartfelt lessons, but I think we've really set ourselves up to, hopefully get back to a place where not just from a technology and security aspect, but also from a talent aspect, as long as we maintain what we've been doing, I think it's all for the future. Me being very optimistic.
Absolutely. Thank you, Brian. We are going to pop up our third and final poll question. where does your organization stand with compliance to OMB M-22-09? And that leads into our next question. Frank, I'll ask you first. What hurdles has your organization faced in terms of modernization due to the recent OMB M-22-09 legislation taking place? And what has been positive about this transition?
So I think for me that the answer is both the challenge and the positive, right? So I think a lot, like I said before, I think a lot of the work that, has turned into zero trust, right, has been underway within NOAA and probably other agencies and organizations for a long time, right? I mean, these are good practices, and implementing them under an executive order is kind of it's just part of the progression of moving towards it. Again, I think that from a technical perspective, there's complexity, right? There's complexity we have to manage, but as we've been talking throughout the day, it's not the technical complexity that we need to that becomes the challenge, right? It's the organizational working through this process through the organization, and it's not everybody's working together. This is right, but if you're taking an enterprise perspective, there are lots of little end cases that we have to work through, and Brian and I kind of talked through that earlier, and I think that that is the biggest hurdle for an organization. Implementing technology, if it's just straightforward technologies, can be simple, but the organizational challenges around it are the hardest, right? But the benefit there is that now that those communication channels open to respond to this EO or to respond to a technical challenge, right? They get stronger, right? And you get to incorporate or get viewpoints from a wider berth in the organization. You certainly get more and deeper requirements than you did, previously, or they get better over time as these communication channels continue to mature. So I think that is both the burden and the positive, right? You have to work through those organizational challenges, make sure you're supporting all your legacy equipment and applications, and finding those edge cases that will hopefully not hurt you too bad later, but you want to know about them. But then having those kind of enhanced communication paths will strengthen the organization going forward, and you get better support and hopefully more folks turning towards mission rather than being an administrator or whatever. Their technical job becomes part of the mission support and driver rather than doing a day-to-day IT job.
Thank you, Frank. Brian, any comments from you on that?
Yeah, I think with regards to the 22-9, I've seen two strategies that haven't worked as well with organizations, and I'll apologize for the background noise too. I'm actually down at a conference this week, so I'll try to speak up a little bit. One area is checkbox compliance. So I need phishing resistant MFA. So I'm going to go out and I'm going to do that and just purchase whether it be security keys or whatnot, and say that will work without looking at why I have other MFAs and gaps. And the other is and it's not just the MFA portion. It's just the easy one to pick on. The other is I have to solve everything all at once, and then it becomes crippling. So rather than checkbox compliance, where on paper, yeah, I can point to it, but actually it's not going to work in my organization because of various use cases. I'm so worried about those various use cases that I can't even get off the ground and get started. And then it's like, oh, I need this all-encompassing RFI, RFP that needs to go out. It has to solve everything, and I have to make sure that I can account for that from the very beginning. And that bogs everything down such that, well, we can't actually get implemented and hit the majority of the use cases. Where I've seen the effective strategy has been the balance. I have this one really challenging use case, or maybe these 3 or 4 really challenging use cases. Let me see what I can do that meets the EO and 22-9 and really the modernization, because that's really what we're focused on, not necessarily the individual mandate, that can meet those use cases. Because if it can meet those, it can probably meet my easy 80% in the 80-20 scheme, right? The really easy ones that can just take a SAML federation. I can probably solve that from anything. But as long as I can hit these 1 or 2 use cases, prove that technology out, And then I'm going to go and implement that in an office by office standpoint. Everyone bring me your really difficult use cases. Okay, you look like you can be a really easy adopter. You look like you're going to be a challenge. I'm going to roll you both out at the same time so that I'm making progress in modernizing my organization and I hit my low-hanging fruit. And then early on, getting in those more challenging situations to make sure that what I validated works. And if not, I can adapt very early on, but all the while I'm still churning forward. I'm not bogged down in I have to solve everything at once before I implement this monolithic structure. So hopefully that makes sense.
Thank you, Brian. So as we come up to the end of our conversation today, I want to hear from both of you. What is a key takeaway from this discussion that you really want to leave our audience with, as well as where can our audience continue to connect with you? Are there any groups that you're a part of for development or platforms that you utilize like LinkedIn? Frank, let's hear from you first on that, and then we'll hear from Brian.
Okay, so I think for me, the key takeaways for this is, right, we have to manage the technology. I think overall, that, you know, approaching a zero trust architecture from a technical perspective has a twofold effect, right? You're going to have a better security posture overall, and more importantly, you have a better insights into what your organization's technology looks like, right? I mean, the identity management is a big part of it. So is the inventory management of technology, right? So the approach in implementing all this gives you a really good, solid technical base to work from into the future. The other side of it is that along with the technology is the organizational practices around it, right? So we all work in complex organizations, and we have a wide berth of technology we have to support in those organizations, whether they be, you know, field products in my case, or legacy applications in other folks' cases. But we have to be able to have those discussions and communication, and not only from, you know, customer service provider, but also from a you know, customer experience perspective, right? Here's where we're going. This is where we have to go as an organization. Here's how we're going to get there together, right? Those are important pieces, and they're as important as the technical pieces. So I think that would be my takeaway for the day. And if there's other ways to get in touch with me, LinkedIn is a great way. There are a lot of no events. I think my next conference talk is at AMS, if anyone's going to AMS and supercomputing and other places. But I'm happy to take questions offline or whatever, connect with whoever's open to it. So thank you.
Yeah, and thanks. Before we go, thanks, Frank, for, you know, I learned a bunch from you and your insight, and I really appreciate you kind of participating, and thanks to ATARC as well, and you, Kirsten, for also moderating, for hosting this. One of the things I'll say, I'll give a plug for ATARC, right? So I'm on the Identity Management Working Group, and we do talk about some of these things. So, you know, we just did and we're having another. So we already had one vendor group come in and do a demonstration around derived FIDO credentials, right? So really just derived PIV with a FIDO variant, following things like NIST Special Publication 157 and 79.2. And we got another vendor who's going to be doing that presentation tomorrow. That happens at 10 a.m. And so, you know, I really, like, if these are topics that we talked about that are something that's really of interest to you, I recommend kind of joining those working groups. And there's a zero trust working group in ATARC as well. And then on top of that, I would say, you know, obviously you can always get in touch with me. I'm on LinkedIn as well. I think, Kirsten, I think the Ping Identity, you know, a small plug for Ping Identity here, right? I think we can help with some of this stuff. I mean, I think our contact information is available to you by joining this conference or webinar. The key takeaways from this, though, is, and we don't talk about this a lot, right? So we talk about zero trust, we talk about these different things, we talk about the best practices, we talk about the culture, which is a huge part of it, but there is technology that has to be implemented here. And it shouldn't be technology of just rip and replace, but technology around, you know, enhance and extend as much as possible, and the interconnecting of solutions. You know, there's no organization in the federal government that sat on their thumbs for 2 straight decades without anything being implemented, right? That's not how the government works, and that's not how we've been able to continuously respond to challenges as they've been coming. The thing about it is we need to understand what we have in these environments and consolidate them as much as possible. Some areas we're going to reduce redundancy, but for the most part, it's around the optimization of investments we've already made. And so I hope that's something that people take away from this, rather than, oh, this vendor is telling me they're the greatest thing since sliced bread and they'll solve all my needs and it'll hit my checkbox, to instead, what technology investments have I made and what is my migration pathway for the operating environment that I wish to be at in the future. And I think as long as you take that approach and you never leave that approach, right? Because we're never going to be done implementing modernization. It's in the name itself, you're always modernizing. And I think people will be in a great position to be successful. So thanks again.
Awesome. Thank you both so much. And for those who have hung around to the very end, thank you all for joining us and the great questions that were sent in. We have a fourth poll question for you, for those that stayed. Would you like to receive your CPE credit for this event? Please let us know so that we can send it to you. I am on LinkedIn. I'm also on Instagram. If you want to connect with me there, I'd be more than happy to share with you more information about ATARC, how you can get involved, in the working group with Brian for Ping Identity. And also, if you have questions for me about Dale Carnegie training, we help companies increase their sales, communication, and leadership. So again, thank you to our partners at Ping Identity and our panelists, and we hope to see you at our next event, which is up on the screen. So if you like this webinar, I'm sure you will like the content for that one, which is Tradewin Solutions Marketplace. All right. Thanks, everyone. Have a great rest of your week, and I will see you at the next one.